Hello everyone, Randy Smith along with Chief Engineer John Mitnik coming to you from the South Florida Water Management District headquarters in West Palm Beach, Florida. We are the regional flood control agency serving 8.1 million people here in South Florida. The Water Management District basically runs from Orlando south to the Keys and contains several thousand miles of canals and levees and other water control structures that John and his staff use to provide year-round flood protection for us here in South Florida. Here we are in almost the middle of June. We're coming off of record-setting rainfall in May. We actually, the heaviest rainfall ever recorded for us here in South Florida in the month of May. The month of June looks like, a little below average so far for the rainfall, but that could certainly change. So what did this burst of our huge surplus of water that we got in May actually do for our flood control system? Well, first of all, Lake Okeechobee, which was a little bit high coming into the wet season, has continued to rise, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers initiated their releases or their discharges from Lake Okeechobee to try to maintain or bring the water levels down early in the wet season. So we're seeing effects of those discharges to the estuaries in the east and the west. Problematic, but the reason for the discharges is the concern over the levels of Lake Okeechobee, the high water levels, and the integrity of the Herbert Hoover Dike that's around it. So that's a core responsibility. Now, as far as the South Florida Water Management District, a lot of structures, a lot of ground to protect, and a lot of operations to be done. John, walk us through how are water levels in district areas, and what are we doing at this point to try to help out in any way we can to provide some relief for these high waters?
Certainly, Randy. As you had said, the month of May had an excessive amount of rainfall, some 300% above normal or average rainfall. And depending on where you live, some areas got way more than that. I think the upper East Coast up here in Martin and St. Lucie County, they got on the order of 450% of what they usually get for the month. So here we are, third year in a row. Mother Nature dealt us a bad hand, and we're going into the wet season with most of the system, whether it's Lake Okeechobee or the 3 water conservation areas, are all full up. So we've been implementing a number of different actions since about the middle of May. May 13th is when the skies opened up and we had all those downpours, and it just was persistent rainfall, intense, excessive rainfall from that point on. So what we've been doing on the Water Management District side, you talked some about Lake Okeechobee and the discharges to the East Coast and to the West Coast that the Army Corps of Engineers is doing. But for our part, what we're trying to do is open up the 3 conservation areas and get a lot of that water out of the conservation areas, either out to tide, go into the Atlantic Ocean, or move it down through the central part of the system and into Everglades National Park.
Let me put some perspective. Here's Lake Okeechobee. The West Palm would be right here in this area, Fort Lauderdale, and then we get to Miami-Dade, and you can see the series of canals that goes throughout this area. This is what John is talking about when he says moving water through this system.
Correct. Let's see if I can zoom in here some, just to the southern part of the system. So when I talk about being able to move water from Lake Okeechobee down into the water conservation areas, you have to have room in those conservation areas for that to be able to accept the water. So there's only, although this looks like a large spatial extent, it's several thousand square miles of land, there's really only 4, maybe 5 outlets to get water from the conservation areas out to the coast over here. One of those routes is right through southern Palm Beach County. It's the Hillsborough Canal. So we've been trying to move as much water out through that route. Of course, a lot of these operations of trying to move water from the conservation areas out to tide along the lower East Coast are what I would call opportunistic, in the sense that we are in the wet season and it is going to rain. So you have to sort of dodge the rainstorms that fall along the lower East Coast. So for everybody who's had those afternoon rain showers, during the morning, we may be letting water out of the conservation area, but in the afternoon, we've got to close it down and turn it off, so to speak, so we can deal with whatever rain fell over here along the coast. So this was one route coming out through the Hillsborough Canal, and we've been consistently trying to get water out of Area 1, or the National Wildlife Refuge there. Another route is right through here, through Broward County. We've been consistently trying to get water out through that route to the tune of 500 cubic feet per second. So to give you an idea of how much water that is, a cubic foot of water is roughly 8 gallons. So for every cubic foot, it's 8 gallons of water. The other route is through, again, through Broward County, through the North New River, right through here. We're trying to move water through that, as well as the last one being through the Miami River down through Miami, coming down this way. And of course, the last route, which the direction where everybody wants the water to go, including us, is down south into Everglades National Park.
So a lot of people, and I hear this quite often, is why don't you open every gate on the south end of Lake Okeechobee and just let it gush out? Well, as from having worked here for a long time, I realize that these structures are really not that big.
Correct. Each one of these structures, and there's 3 of them, 1, 2, and 3 here, they have a certain size and a certain amount of water that they're physically able to move. And one of the things we have been able to do over the past week or so, because as we've gotten into the beginning of June, it hasn't been raining as much, we have been able to start moving water from the lake down the Miami Canal and put it into a newly constructed storage facility right here in the central EAA, or the Everglades Agricultural Area, and store that water there before it's treated, moved down into the water conservation area. But again, one of the main obstacles between moving water out of Lake Okeechobee down into the conservation areas is just simply the volume of water and the depth of water that is already in the conservation areas at this time of year, causing problems with the conservation areas both from a wildlife perspective, the natural native flora and fauna, as well as, although we're not there, we still have a ways to go. If it gets too high, then you start having levee safety concerns about the East Coast Protective Levee that runs along the eastern side of the conservation areas.
Back in 2016, when we had incredibly high water levels in Water Conservation Area 3, I think maybe 250 days straight of water being above the point where the scientists expected harm to be done to the wildlife and to the tree islands. And you said that the water in Water Conservation Area 3 is high now. What kind of options are you looking at for if things don't turn around for providing some relief to Water Conservation Area 3 and ultimately, freeing up some room to bring more water south?
Right. So for Conservation Area 3 right here, although we are not as high as we ultimately got last year, we are currently higher than we were at this time last year. So we're going into the wet season with the remaining couple months of the wet season left to go, and you're already higher than you were last go around, so to speak. So what we've been trying to do is we've been talking with our federal partners, both the Army Corps of Engineers and the Department of Interior and the Fish and Wildlife Service, to be able to change some of the operations in the southern portion of the system down here in order to help move that water out of the conservation area and into Everglades National Park. Specifically, what I'm talking about is raising the level that this canal is allowed to be operated at, as well as opening some of these additional water control structures over here that are currently closed for this time of year due to nesting habitat for the Cape Sable seaside sparrow.
And that would require approval from the federal government to make any changes. And I believe that we've already made a request that they consider these. And the canal John's talking about is the one that runs right along the Tamiami Trail and splits the park from the water conservation areas. So John, that's a really good update of where we are, and of course, we're very early in the wet season. It looks like it's going to be a challenge mounting for us, but we will continue to provide regular updates, just like we did today, to let you know what the South Florida Water Management District is doing to make sure that we're doing everything possible to provide some relief for the situation, and just to keep you informed on what the conditions are in our area.